Guys love dropping the laundry, especially on the tricky gadget plays. Hi everyone, this is Will O'Toole for Park Ridge Sports History, welcoming you to another edition as I just dropped my pen. All things sports, all things that just come off the top of my head about sports this week. The cartoon that I just showed about a referee kind of dropping the laundry. Of course, it's a little tongue-in-cheek and a lot of fun. I referee myself, so I know sometimes referees are seen, or any kind of official is seen as taking too much part in the thrill of dropping the old laundry or assessing a penalty and ruining a good game. But I'd like to focus on a couple of, let's say, controversial calls in sports, American sports, that have led to either teams going on to a dynasty or potentially things wrecking a dynasty, or maybe just somewhere in between. And I'd like to focus maybe on 4 or 5. And of course, one has to do with the New York Yankees. And we are, if you're an old Yankee fan and you were around with the core 4, although sometimes I call it the core 5 with George Posada, you'll realize that 1996, they had the famous Jeffrey Mayer game, a Bergen County resident, as Jeffrey Mayer was, and he was out in right field, probably cutting that day or playing hooky, but he was with family and friends, and it's always a lot of fun to go to games when, I don't know, everybody else is in school and you're doing a family outing, and it's a great thing. Anyway, it was late in the game, and for obvious reasons, I'm not going to give all of the details particular to that, but outfielder Tarasco for the Orioles was playing right field when Derek Jeter came up, and of course Jeter, with that inside-out swing, hit a shot out to right field that maybe could have been caught by Tarasco, but he is up against the wall, is about to leap, and maybe at the very worst make an attempt at the ball, went out of the outfield, kind of like the Thing from the old Addams Family show. These hands come out and grab the ball from the clutches of Tarasco, and who is it but 12-year-old Jeffrey Mayer. And he catches the ball, and the outfield umpire, because during the playoffs, they expand the number of umpires on the field, signaled for a home run. And probably if we had that game today, they would probably go under the camera, probably go back to New York or to Secaucus and take a number of looks from 8,000 different camera angles. And potentially, I'm not saying that they would have overturned the call, but there might be a likelihood that that call could have been overturned. As it was, it stayed as a home run. And the Yankees do win the game. They do win the series. They do win the pennant that year in 96. They are down 2-0 to the Braves going to Atlanta, and they do come back and beat the Braves in 6 games and then go on their roll, having a mini Yankee dynasty, even though it was kind of sidetracked in 97 off the bat of Sandy Alomar Jr., and the Indians, of course, go on to the pennant that year. But the Yankees would win in 96, 98, 99, 2000, 2001, 2003, and really win a number of World Series, including beating the Mets, sweeping the Padres, and really branding that core 4 of Mariano, Derek, Jeter, Bernie Williams. And I like to put it, Andy Pettit, but I also like to include George Posada in that. I know it's not core 4 then. I kind of call it core 4-5. But they were all brought up in the Yankee system. And, that team, what people don't realize about that Yankee dynasty, I'm going to call it a dynasty. No one else was able to do that when you think about it. Even the A's, only won 3 World Series in a row. But those Yankee teams were not just focused on those 5 guys, but they always seemed to go out and get that veteran who always added, never detracted from the team, and always did something significant in the postseason. I'm talking about guys like, well, I won't include Paul O'Neill because he was specifically traded for, but you have Wade Boggs. Then you can add maybe Roger Clemens, David Cone, Cecil Fielder, and a host of other players who just added depth and experience to the Yankee bench. Tim Raines. It was just an amazing group of players. And although I never rooted for the Yankees, you do come to admire just their stick-to-itiveness, unconquerable spirit. They just never quit. And so much, I think you have to give that success to the Yankees, to really Joe Torre, and to really the core 5, because I always thought this, Pettit, I think, is a Hall of Fame pitcher, tremendous amount of wins in the postseason. I think going into this, he has the most postseason wins, not World Series, but the most postseason wins of any pitcher in the history of the game. I just always, with the exception of maybe Game 6 in the Arizona series, I always, being a Yankee hater, hated seeing him on the mound, especially when the Yankees were in a must-win situation, because I knew he was going to just do the job. And I knew that the Yankees were going to come back in the series and probably win the series, so it was very frustrating if you're not a Yankee fan. It was exhilarating if you were a Pettit fan and a Bronx Bomber fan, knowing that Pettit was there and, for the most part, always rallied the Yankees. So that one play, maybe a call that wasn't made by the umpire, really leads to that Yankee dynasty in the 21st century. And, of course, that leads to another dynasty, different sport, different rival. I will tell you this, before I get to that, I was thinking about this. Dave Johnson was the manager of that 96 Oriole team. And what's interesting is that you could argue, was on the wrong side of the coin there with a bad umpire call. Maybe Tarasco could have caught the ball, and maybe the Orioles do win the game and potentially win the series. But 26 years prior to that, Davey Johnson benefited from a bad call by the umpires, specifically Ken Burkhart of the home plate umpire in the 70 World Series between the Orioles and the Reds. And I know I have spoken on Park Ridge Sports History a number of times about that series, about the Reds and the Orioles. But you have to remember, growing up, they were 2 of the big teams during the 70s. It wasn't really the Yankees. And obviously it wasn't the Angels or the Giants. And so it wasn't the Red Sox, really, even though they have those 2 nice teams in 75 and 78. But in Game 1, and this is why I bring this up, the Reds seemed to have the momentum. Ty Klein was at bat. He hit a little, how ironic is this, Baltimore chop in front of the plate. Ellie Hendricks, who was the catcher for the Orioles, goes out and grabs the ball barehanded, turns as Carbo's coming in. Now, I'm pretty sure if you see the replays of that, Carbo never touched home plate. He slid past it, I believe. But Ellie Hendricks never tags him. Yes, he does. He tags him with the glove, but not with the ball in the mitt. The ball was held in his bare hand. He touches him with the mitt. Now, Burkhart, for whatever reason, and I really do believe this, I think he anticipated the Baltimore chop potentially going foul, and he kind of comes out behind the catcher's box and goes up the line, and he's actually in the field of play. But he twists his body the wrong way and kind of, if you ever see the replay, it's almost like he loses his balance. But anyway, his back is to the play between Ellie Hendricks and Bernie Carbo, and he has to turn his head towards the play. and he called Carbo out. The funny thing is, as I stated, Hendricks does touch Carbo, but with the mitt and not with the ball. That's visible on all the replays in his bare hands. Carbo, though, and I'm almost 99.9% sure about this, never touched the bag going or home plate going in, sliding in. But when he got up to argue the play, he does tag or step on the plate. So he should have been safe. Except brilliantly, and of course, this might have been the tutoring of, let's say, Earl Weaver, part of the instruction. Hendricks never goes back to tag him. And perhaps if he did tag him, Burkhart would have reversed his call. But the fact that Hendricks never tagged him kind of probably signaled to Burkhart that he had made the right call, the right wrong call. And he kept with it, no matter how many times Anderson argued and how many times that Carbo argued. And of course, you got to remember that Carbo was just a rookie that year. And you can see in the replays, Anderson just pushing him out of the way. But in all reality, I think that, and I've said in the past that there was another play in the game that really turned it. But many baseball scholars, researchers, and fans always turn to that one particular play in game one in Riverfront and say the series kind of changed there. I've always said no, the series changed on another, but there definitely, if it wasn't a momentum shifter, it just added onto the momentum that the Orioles were gaining. And of course, they would go on to win that game and win the World Series in 4 out of 5. Now, why I think that's so significant is that turns out to be Earl Weaver's only World Series win, even though the Orioles get the 3 straight championships. Enough with Weaver, enough with the Orioles and the Reds. Like to move on to a different sport, football. And of course, this is the Tuck game that was played in the snow, the real raw elements of football that so many fans of my generation clamor for, and that is, the mud, what my brothers used to call gut ball, where it was snowing and turning up mud. And as I've noted before, it always seemed like the games involved Green Bay and Cleveland was always in their white uniform. So within the first 30 seconds, every player on the Cleveland roster was just caked with mud and snow and blood. And the games always seemed to be like 23-17, the Packers winning. But that game was played in the snow, albeit on artificial turf. The Patriots were playing the villain of the game. It's interesting. Oh, well, interesting. Let me just digress a little bit, of course, and this was the whole point of bringing up the Reds, is that Davey Johnson was at second base in that 70 World Series, and his team benefited from maybe a bad call by the ump, and then 26 years later, taking over the helm of the Orioles as their manager was kind of had potentially a series stolen from him by a bad call by the umpire. So it's funny how things are cyclical. Anyway, going back, the Patriots were playing the villains of the day, and that was Al Davis's Raiders. Notice what I said, the Raiders. They were playing in Oakland, but for all intents and purposes, it could have been Los Angeles. It could have been Las Vegas, because the Raiders move more often, I tell you, than anything else. And who knows, tomorrow they may be in San Diego. But in that game, and of course there have been conspiracy theories that the league, because they had so many conflicts with Al Davis, particularly Pete Rozelle, but anyway, the NFL commissioner's office and the other owners had so many problems with Al Davis that it was almost a payback type of thing, conspiracy theory, stating that on this call, if you recall, Brady's going back, Oakland defensive player comes in and sacks him, but at the moment of the sack, the collision, Brady is seen potentially, it looks like he's tucking the ball. And the ball, of course, falls, and the Raiders recover an apparent fumble. But the referees got together and said that no, that he was in the process of throwing the ball. So in that case, it was an incomplete. And of course, there's a big brouhaha. Who knows? And I'm not saying that referees are influenced by the home crowd, but sometimes, these things you do kind of figure into the elements of a particular play call. But you wonder if the play would have been differently officiated had it been in Oakland or Las Vegas or Los Angeles, or if it had been a different team than the Raiders. If it had been, let's say, the Jets or the Buffalo Bills, etc., would that play have been differently officiated? Anyway, I'm not accusing the refs at all, but these are what many people said after the game. That game would eventually be won on a field goal in overtime, as Brady, of course, took that second chance, rallied the Patriots to victory, and of course they go on and win. It seemed like they were always guest starring in every Super Bowl in the 21st century, and that is one of the reasons why Brady is seen as the greatest of all time, aka the GOAT of football. And of course, he's working his magic right now to a certain extent in Tampa Bay, trying to resurrect that franchise and get it into, a playoff position. But Brady really turned the corner. I think that Belichick, who had some, people don't realize this, he was successful in Cleveland, and then Modell moves that team from Cleveland, or announces it in the 95 season that they were going to move to Baltimore, and everything just caved in on Cleveland and on the team and on Belichick. They finished terribly. Belichick is ultimately removed from the Cleveland Brown position. He does get a second shot after being named the jet coach and going off to New England and Foxborough, and of course the rest is history. And now Belichick is without a doubt regarded on the Mount Rushmore of all-time NFL coaches. He's at least up there, and debatably is just as regarded or seen as the greatest head coach of all time. Vince Lombardi or not, that could be an argument for another day, and a fun debate at that. People would say, well, Lombardi didn't have to go through as many playoff games as New England. And you could also argue that, you basically had to win your division in the NFL to get to the championship game. So you couldn't make mistakes or have a bad loss during the season like sometimes the NFL teams of today do. And obviously, you couldn't finish with a kind of mediocre record, albeit even under 500, and qualify for the playoffs back in the 60s like you can today. So there's a lot of, pros and cons to both. It is quite a bit of fun to debate that. And anybody who's watched the shows in the past, I've talked about how Don Shula, the great Don Shula, had more shutouts than all those guys combined in many respects. And of course, we've talked about how the rules are so different today that it's so much easier to score, and it's so much harder to prevent an opponent from scoring because they have really liberated the offensive rules and really fettered the defensive players. But that tuck rule, as it became to be known, people don't realize this, and I didn't realize it until I was doing some investigation, that the head coach, well, I should say, most guys probably do know this, but didn't realize this, that John Gruden was the head coach of that Oakland squad. And at least he would get a reprieve and later on win a Super Bowl. And now he's back, ironically, with the Las Vegas Raiders, not the Oakland Raiders. So just a little bit about that. I think it did make, though, that particular game really opened eyes about kind of the clutch performance of another guy in that Patriot team, Adam Vinatieri, who would go on and win a couple of Super Bowls with the Patriots and have a integral part with his field goal kicking and his prowess for hitting the clutch field goals. So kudos to him as well, that tuck rule. Third thing I'd like to pick up on, another game I was going to think about that may have had really some implications, and that is the 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich, one that was marred by terrorism and all the rest of it. But for most American basketball fans, not only do they remember that tragedy, but they also remember just probably perhaps the worst officiating in the history of all sports, at least from an American perspective. And that was the basketball final between the Soviet Union and the United States basketball team that was coached by Hank Iba. And that 72, I was just doing some investigating on it, just seeing it again. I do recall it. Of course, I don't remember seeing the game live. I only saw replays of, let's say, that final couple of minutes of action. And I was, I think, in the 6th or 7th grade when that Olympics was going on. In fact, it was late summer, early September, that those games were being played. And of course, you didn't get to stay up like you were because you just went back to school and all the rest of it. Plus, they didn't have the technology or, let's say, the TV broadcasting emphasis on these games like they do today. That game, though, I do recall they had a number of chances. Well, first of all, let me just set it up. The U.S. had never lost in the Olympics. And when I was doing some investigating for the show, I never realized that the United States did actually lose some international competition to the Russians. But they were in, let's say, quote unquote, lesser tournaments. But they never lost. The United States never lost a basketball game in Olympic history. So obviously, we won every Olympic gold medal up until 1972. And of course, some of the great players who performed for the United States, the great Bill Russell, all right, on that 56 team. Okay, so I'm just thinking of him offhand. And of course, now I'm just having another brain lock about it. But that 72 team, what stood out for me on that team, and I'm just going to give you the lineup. Just take a look at this if I can. That 72 team probably had the fewest players that I would consider great basketball players who had great basketball careers, with the exception of one or two. I'm just going to do a quick rundown of the lineup. Mike Banham, who went to St. Joe's University, was on that team. And he was a serviceable player in both the ABA and the NBA. In fact, I think he played for the Nets. And he was on the Nets teams when they came from the ABA into the NBA in '76. Jim Brewer, who I can recall would be involved. He played for the University of Minnesota. I think he was just a sophomore when he was selected for that team. But Jim Brewer's Minnesota team, I actually remember him not so much for the Olympics, but later on, the University of Minnesota, and they had a guy by the name of Dave Winfield on this Minnesota squad. They would have a huge fight with Ohio State, and it was a real brawl. And I'll never forget it. Sports Illustrated did a whole feature on this, on the Big Ten, but particularly featured this game. And a guy by the name of Luke Whitty was kicked by Minnesota players. Don't know who it was. I just know that Brewer was on that team along with Dave Winfield, and it turned into a bloody mess. And I know that Whitty really suffered some real injuries in that game. He does go on to play in the NBA, Luke Whitty. But I just remember him. He played for Ohio State. He was about 6'8". You know, in the old days, the players all look like Larry Bird. Real tall and thin. Not like today where they're just sculpted. You know, they all look like football players today, the NBA players. You know, heavily muscled, but still very adroit, very agile. But they looked like string beans out there. But I remember that Luke Whitty was about 6'8", seemed like that typical, stereotypical farm boy from the Midwest. And Jim Brewer's University of Minnesota Gophers team played the Ohio State Buckeyes in a Big Ten conference game, and it turned into a dirty battle. But I remember him, and he was a member of that Olympic team, Jim Brewer. And in fact, reading also in this game, didn't realize this, Brewer was a dirty play on Brewer. And he got into a shoving match with a Russian rival and actually was thrown out of the game. And it really hurt the United States because Brewer was not a big scorer, but he did a lot of rebounding, just good passing, played good defense, got you 10 points a game. And again, he played in the NBA, again, as a serviceable player. But I just remember him more from that Ohio State debacle than from the Olympic team. You got to remember, we didn't get to see every game. They would just ABC would just kind of like show you highlights of these games. And this game being played in Munich, they didn't even prime time the game. I even think that you saw it in tape delay. Tommy Burleson was also on that team. And Burleson, I remember, he was a big guy. He was about 7'2". Sometimes he was listed as 7'4". He was on the '74 North Carolina State Wolfpack team that featured, of course, David Thompson. David Thompson, for all those who never saw him, he was kind of called Skywalker, kind of a tragic figure. He was, you could actually say, and I know, and I'm not, being hurtful. He just always reminded you, he was like an early prototype. That's the best way to say it. He was like an early prototype of what Michael Jordan became. He was that good. You know, he does score 73 points for the Denver Nuggets. And he was a very good player. He probably, unfortunately, he had some problems in his life, and he never really attained really that superstar status. Always liked Thompson. The funny thing is, I was rooting for Marquette in that '74 series, but they finished, the Wolfpack team under Norm Sloan finished unbeaten that year. And the interesting thing is that they had beaten UCLA in the semifinals to reach the finals of the '74 Final Four and win the whole thing, beating Marquette and Al McGuire. Interestingly enough, Al McGuire, I think, picks up 2 technical fouls, or at least one, in that championship game and kind of turns the game around for the Wolfpack. But Al McGuire would kind of get revenge and win a championship 3 years later in 1977 and actually beat the Wolfpack's rival and Dean Smith, and prevent Dean Smith from winning his first championship. And he beat the Four Corners as Marquette rallied with many of those same freshmen, some of those freshmen from that '74 team, and would defeat the North Carolina Tar Heels in the '77 NCAA Final Four. They had guys like Butch Lee on that '77 team. They had a guy named Jimmy Boylan on that Marquette team in '77. He was from Jersey City, went to Hudson Catholic. They had a couple other guys, not Maurice Lucas. He was, I think, on that '74 team, but left to go to the NBA and later plays with Bill Walton with the '77 Portland Trailblazers and wins a championship. They had Bo Ellis, had a number of guys, Jerome Whitehead, who would go on and win a championship for Al in his last year in college basketball. Another guy, well, I'm going to save this guy. They had guys like Kenny Davis, who went to Georgetown College, not Georgetown University. So you can see, I'm talking about St. Joe's, University of Minnesota, NC State. So far, the guys that I've mentioned are playing not on the traditional power teams that you consider. No UCLA players. All right. There was Bobby Jones of UNC, Chapel Hill, who did play for, of course, the great Dean Smith. He was on that team, and Bobby Jones was known more for his defense. He was another guy, real wiry, real tall, real thin, typical basketball player of the 60s and 70s. I know that he played for both the 76ers, and I think he wound up playing also with the Denver Nuggets. Another good player, known more as defense. So you can see where I'm going with this team. Mostly defense, not so much offense. They had a guy named Dwight Jones, played for the University of Houston Cougars, and Kevin Joyce, who was at South Carolina. Those teams featured, they had some good teams in the early 70s and late 60s at South Carolina. And South Carolina, I believe, was under head coach Frank McGuire, Al McGuire's brother. And they had other guys on that team, that Kevin Joyce. They had guys like, later on, South Carolina would have Brian Winters, who went on to play for the Milwaukee Bucks for a number of years. They had a great player, and now his name escapes me. I'll take a look. I'll go on it in a second. Great player, Alex English. That was his name. Really good player. I know that he was like also poetry was his favorite hobby. But this team, he was not a member of that 72 team. You had Dwight Jones, Kevin Joyce from South Carolina, a New Yorker no less. Tom McMillan, who played at Maryland, wasn't as tall as Tommy Burleson. And as a kid, I got to be very honest with you, I often confuse McMillan with Burleson because they were both very tall, very thin, both Caucasian players. McMillan, of course, was only 6'11", and Burleson was about 7'2" to 7'4". And of course, oh, by the way, along with David Thompson on that North Carolina team, you talk about a mutt and Jeff. Tom Burleson at 7'3", let's just say, split the difference. He played with a guy named Monty Toe on that North Carolina Wolfpack team. I think he was 5'2", Monty Toe, and he was like the point guard on that team. So that's 3 of the 5 Wolfpack players that I remember just offhand. And then they had a guy named Ed Ratliff. Now, Ratliff goes on to play, I think he actually played for the Houston Rockets. He was an All-American, and I think he was probably the best player that Jerry Tarkanian ever recruited to Long Beach State. Now, the reason why I say that is that Tarkanian and John Wooden were bitter rivals when Tarkanian was at Long Beach State. And I think it kind of carried over when they went to UNLV, when he goes to UNLV. But Ratliff was on that 72 team. And I believe in one of the NCAA regionals, they lose to UCLA, and Wooden would never schedule San Diego State, or later on it would never schedule UNLV on his schedule. But they do meet in the NCAA, and Tarkanian and Long Beach State loses, I think, by a point late in the game, like almost like a last second type of thing. I think it was like 54-53, but they lose. And of course, UCLA winds up in the Final Four, et cetera, et cetera. But the main focus of this team, and he was actually a number 1 draft pick, and that's why I saved him for last, was a guy by the name of Doug Collins, who was an All-American from Illinois State. So he played for the Redbirds. He does become a number 1 draft pick of the 76ers. He was on that 77 Sixers team that loses to the Portland Trailblazers. That actually was a pretty good series, even though it only went 6. They had Dr. J on that team, the 76ers. They had a guy from the Indiana Pacers that they brought over and signed as well, George McGinnis, who was on that team. Kind of, they were hoping for a better fit. The 76ers, those couple of years of McGinnis and Dr. J and Collins, they were good, but they never really, the chemistry was never there. The Portland Trailblazers had raced off to a huge start. It was one of the only healthy seasons that Bill Walton ever had, and they had a fast break that was just unbelievable. It rivaled, the great Celtic fast break teams, or even the Lakers with Magic Johnson. But they had a guy named Bobby Gross, Larry Steele, and they had Maurice Lucas, and of course they had Bill Walton, and they defeat Doug Collins and the 76ers. And of course, Collins goes on to coach and to broadcast. But real quick, Collins, late in the game, and of course, it really was we would regard it as a very chippy game, a very physical game. And unfortunately, the United States, for the most part, was stuck playing more of the Soviet game, because at halftime it was only 26-25. And but in the late stages, the United States battles back. They lose Brewer. They lose Brewer in the game with the fighting and all the rest of it. And the Russians, or the Soviets, actually benefit by losing that talented player. Anyway, the Russians or Soviets had held a lead throughout. The United States teams chipped away. Late in the game, Collins steals the ball and is about to go in for a layup when he's decked. And probably today, the funny thing is, you would probably see an official go up, cross his arms like this, and call an intentional foul because he was hit hard. He goes into the stand that holds the basketball net and goal, and Collins is awarded 2 free throws. With the first shot he hits, and as he's about, and this is where the controversy begins. Apparently, as the second shot, he's about to shoot the second shot, and a horn goes off. Now, I've said in previous things, before I reread this, that it was done to disrupt his concentration, but he just coolly and calmly and like a pro sinks the second shot. Apparently, the Russian coach had signaled for a timeout. There was a delay, even though he had raced down to the scoreboard operator and asked for a timeout, and the official blew the horn as Collins shot. The referee, one was from Brazil. His name was, I'm going to say it's Rigoda. I know I'm saying it the wrong way, but he apparently dismissed it as an error. And in international rules, as soon as the ball went in, it's no longer dead. It's a live ball. The Russians bring it out and don't score. And you think the game is over. Hold on for a second. They're given a second opportunity, because now they were making everyone aware that they had called a timeout, even though the points weren't taken off. And then as you read further, no timeout was ever scratched out in the scorebook. Make a long story short, they try to inbounds the ball again. It's unsuccessful, and you're saying that the United States won. Hold on for another second. They have to redo it. This time, according to the story I was reading, Tommy Burleson, all spider arms and legs, was asked to move by the referee who was in charge of the inbounds pass there. His name was, I'm going to see if I can pronounce this, Artenik Arabajian. Artenik Arabajian. And the reason why he moved back, even though he didn't have to give ground, he was afraid that the referee would say, you know what, I'm going to assess you a technical for being, let's say, unsportsmanship. He just didn't want to take a chance. This is really the United States not being fully engrossed or aware of international rules, because they're not used to playing it. All right. Ball goes in. There's a fight, as it's kind of like a, one of those alley-oop kind of passes from the sideline. Joyce goes up. The Soviet Union player goes up, and of course the name escapes me, and I'm probably, even if I said the name, I would probably mess it up. I think his last name began with a B. Anyway, he goes up, he comes down with it and just launches, let's say, just a prayer shot, and it goes in. Game is over, and the place is in mayhem. And the United States loses. And they feel, rightfully so, that they were cheated. And the reason being, hey, the Russians didn't just get one shot. They didn't just get 2 shots. They got 3 shots before they got it right. And this is after all that transpired prior to those last few seconds in the game. All I know is this. This is what I most remember about that game. The United States felt cheated, and rightfully so. Kind of the rules would change, and I think that the United States, after their '88 loss in Korea under John Thompson, they decided they would never just go with amateurs again. That once they opened up the rules to professionals, they were just going to bring their NBA team, which is why that dream team of '92 with Bird, Johnson, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Michael Jordan was just a fun thing to watch. And for Americans, it was kind of redeeming. It doesn't, cover up the wound. It certainly, there will always be a scar from the '72 basketball game against the Soviet Union, but at least it kind of, it really doesn't. But it was fun to watch. It really doesn't stop the hurt that you still get from that '72 thing, ripoff. And the interesting thing is that to this day, I do know this, that those silver medals that the United States was supposed to get as finishing runner-up to the Soviet Union, they refused them, and they're in some bank vault in Zurich, Switzerland. And to this day, none of those players or coaches on that staff have ever inquired or even reached out to claim those medals. This is Will O'Toole for Park Ridge Sports History. Thank you again for allowing me to come into your homes and talk everything sports. Have a great week.